Isn't this delicious? Look who just broke the entire academic industrial complex with nothing but caffeine and pure unfiltered chaos. 7 minutes? That's all you had? 7 pathetic minutes, while they had 7 lifetimes of credentials hanging on their walls like participation trophies. And yet here we are, watching them scramble to understand how you just demolished everything they thought they knew about intelligence. About preparation, about the very nature of genius itself. Let me paint you a picture of what happened in that room. 7 of the world's most decorated minds, sitting around a mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars, each one clutching their leather-bound portfolios like security blankets. Harvard, MIT, Oxford, names that make normal people genuflect. And then there's you, walking in with yesterday's clothes, 3 hours of sleep, and a half-empty can of Monster that's probably been sitting in your car since Tuesday. They looked at you like you were lost, like someone's intern who took a wrong turn on the way to the copy machine. One of them actually asked if you were there to fix the projector. The others laughed, that careful, calculated laugh that people use when they're trying to maintain professional distance. They had no idea they were about to witness their own intellectual funeral. You see, while they spent decades accumulating papers and accolades, you were out there in the real world, getting your education from failure, from chaos, from the University of Figure It Out or Starve. They memorized theories. You memorized survival. They studied success in controlled environments. You studied it in the wild, where one wrong move means game over. The mission briefing started exactly at 9:00 because that's when important things happen in their world. Everything's scheduled, everything sanitized, everything predictable. The project manager, some silver-haired fossil who probably hasn't had an original thought since the Clinton administration, starts laying out the problem. Complex algorithms, market predictions, behavioral analytics, words designed to intimidate anyone who didn't spend their 20s buried in textbooks. But you weren't intimidated. You were bored. Because while he was explaining the problem in language designed to exclude people like you, your brain was already 10 steps ahead. Not because you're smarter in the traditional sense, but because you learned something they never did. You learned how to see patterns in chaos, how to find solutions in impossibility, how to think without the guardrails of academic conditioning. They gave everyone 2 weeks to prepare their proposals, 14 days to research, analyze, create PowerPoints with perfect formatting and citations in APA style. They probably went home to their pristine offices, fired up their expensive computers, and started building their presentations, one scholarly source at a time. Meanwhile, you forgot about it completely. Not because you're irresponsible, but because your mind doesn't work on their timeline. Fast forward to 7 minutes before the presentation. You're in the parking lot, that Monster can, your only companion, when your phone buzzes. The meeting reminder, the same meeting you'd forgotten about entirely. Most people would panic. Most people would make excuses, maybe fake a family emergency. But you're not most people. You smiled, because this is where you thrive. This is your natural habitat, the space between impossible and inevitable. You walked into that boardroom with nothing but the clothes on your back and the chemicals coursing through your veins. No slides, no handouts, no rehearsed corporate speak. Just you, standing in front of 7 people who collectively spent more on their education than some countries spend on defense. They looked at you with that mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment, like watching someone about to belly flop from the high dive. "I don't have a presentation," you said. And the room got quiet. That special kind of quiet that happens right before someone gets fired. But then you continued. "Because presentations are for people who need to hide behind graphics. I'm gonna solve your problem right here, right now, with nothing but what's in my head." The energy in the room shifted, from pity to curiosity, from dismissal to attention. You started talking, and it wasn't the measured, careful speech of academia. It was raw. It was real. It was the kind of truth that only comes from someone who's lived outside the bubble. You broke down their complex problem into components so simple that a child could understand them. Not because you dumbed it down, but because you could see through the unnecessary complexity they'd wrapped around it like armor. The first PhD tried to interrupt. Something about methodology, about peer review, about the proper channels for hypothesis formation. You didn't even slow down. You acknowledged his point and then destroyed it with logic so clean it was almost surgical. "Your methodology assumes controlled variables," you said, "but this problem exists in the real world, where variables don't behave. Your peer review process takes months. The market moves in milliseconds. Your hypothesis formation follows rules written by people who've never had to bet their rent money on being right." That shut him up. But the others were warming up, ready to defend their territory. The economists started quoting theories. The data scientist brought up statistical models. The behavioral psychologist referenced studies from journals you'd never heard of. And one by one, you took their weapons and turned them into toys, not through aggression, but through a kind of intellectual aikido that used their own expertise against them. You see, they'd spent so long in their specialized silos that they'd forgotten how to think holistically. Each one was a master of their domain, but blind to how their domain connected to the others. You weren't a master of anything, you were a student of everything, and that made you dangerous in ways they couldn't comprehend. 20 minutes in, something beautiful happened. They stopped trying to challenge you and started trying to understand you. The hostility melted into fascination. These people who'd spent their careers being the smartest person in every room were watching someone operate on a completely different frequency, not above them or below them, but perpendicular to their entire axis of understanding. You pulled out your phone and started sketching diagrams on a napkin someone had left on the table, not because you needed visual aids, but because you could see they did. Your drawings looked like the fever dreams of a caffeinated madman, but somehow they made more sense than all their perfectly formatted slides combined. You were speaking their language now, but with an accent they'd never heard. The energy drink was hitting different by this point. Your hands were moving faster than your mouth, creating connections between concepts that shouldn't connect, building bridges between islands of knowledge they thought were separate continents. You weren't just solving their problem, you were showing them that the problem they thought they had wasn't even the real problem. "Your entire framework is based on a false assumption," he said, and the room held its breath. "You're trying to predict human behavior using models built for machines. But humans aren't machines. We're chaos wrapped in skin, pretending to be logical. Your PhDs taught you to eliminate variables. But the variables are where the magic lives. The outliers aren't errors in your data. They're the future trying to tell you something." The youngest PhD, the one who still had some fire in her eyes, leaned forward. "So what do you suggest?" It wasn't a challenge, It was genuine curiosity. And that's when you knew you had them, not because you'd defeated them, but because you'd freed them from their own intellectual prisons. You laid out a solution so elegant in its simplicity that it felt like remembering something they'd always known but forgotten. Use the chaos instead of fighting it. Build systems that adapt instead of predict. Stop trying to control outcomes and start creating conditions for emergence. It wasn't just a solution to their immediate problem. It was a completely different way of thinking about problems. The CEO, who'd been silent this whole time, finally spoke. How long would implementation take? You could see him doing math in his head, calculating budgets and timelines and resource allocation, all the things that CEOs do when they're trying to fit revolution into a spreadsheet. You took another sip of Monster, now warm and flat but still doing its job. 7 days, you said? The room erupted. Impossible. Unfeasible. Their proposals had timelines measured in quarters, not days. But you weren't done. 7 days if we do it your way, with committees and meetings and approvals. 7 hours if we do it mine. 7 minutes if you're willing to really let go of control. The audacity of it hung in the air like electricity before a storm. You explained how their entire approach was backwards. They were trying to build perfection in isolation, then deploy it to chaos. You wanted to build in chaos and let perfection emerge. They wanted guarantees. You offered possibilities. They wanted control. You offered power. Not the same thing, though most people never learn the difference. The data scientist pulled out his laptop and started running numbers. His fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to model what you were proposing. After a few minutes, he looked up with an expression somewhere between confusion and revelation. "This shouldn't work," he said. "According to everything I know, this should fail spectacularly." You smiled. Everything you know was taught by people who were taught by people who were taught by people who read about it in books. When was the last time any of them actually built something from nothing? That hit different. You could see it in their faces. These brilliant minds suddenly confronting the possibility that their brilliance had been confined to very specific containers. That outside those containers, in the wild spaces where you lived, different rules applied. Not better or worse rules, just different. And different was what they needed. The behavioral psychologist was scribbling notes furiously. Not the careful, structured notes of academic observation, but the chaotic scratches of someone whose worldview was being renovated in real time. "You're talking about emergent behavior," she said. "But at a scale that this is unprecedented." You shrugged. Precedent is just another word for limitation. Every breakthrough was unprecedented until someone did it. By now, the Monster can was empty, but you didn't need it anymore. You were running on something stronger than caffeine. You were running on the pure adrenaline of watching 7 of the smartest people in the room realize that smart wasn't enough. That all their credentials and accolades were just expensive armor that was actually weighing them down. The meeting that was supposed to last 2 hours had stretched to 3. Nobody mentioned it, nobody checked their phones or looked at their watches. They were too busy watching you dismantle and rebuild their entire conceptual framework. Not with malice, but with the kind of brutal compassion that only comes from someone who's been broken and rebuilt themselves 1,000 times. You started telling them stories, not case studies or academic examples, but real stories from the trenches. About the time you had to pivot an entire business model in 48 hours because the market shifted. About building algorithms on bar napkins that outperformed $1 million systems. about solving problems that experts said were unsolvable, not because you were smarter, but because you didn't know they were supposed to be unsolvable. The Harvard MBA tried one last stand, something about risk management and fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value, all the words they teach you to say when you want to sound important while saying nothing. You let him finish, then asked a simple question. What's the bigger risk? Trying something new and possibly failing, or continuing with something that's definitely failing, but failing in a predictable way? Silence. The kind of silence that happens when truth lands like a sledgehammer on glass houses. Because they all knew their current approach was failing. That's why they were here. That's why they'd assembled this brain trust. But they'd been trying to solve new problems with old tools, like performing surgery with stone knives. You could see the shift happening in real time. These weren't stupid people, they were brilliant. But brilliance trapped in rigid frameworks is just elaborate stupidity. And you were showing them how to break free, not by destroying what they knew, but by expanding it. By showing them that their knowledge was powerful but incomplete, that the missing piece wasn't more knowledge, but a different way of applying it. The silver-haired project manager, the one who'd laughed at you in the beginning, cleared his throat. I've been in this business for 30 years, he said. I've worked with Nobel laureates and industry pioneers, and I've never... He struggled for words, this man who'd built a career on having the right words. This is exactly what we didn't know we needed. You stood up, and it felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Here's the thing, you said, gathering the napkins covered with your chaotic brilliance. You've all been trained to build bridges. Beautiful, perfect bridges that take years to complete. But sometimes you don't need a bridge. Sometimes you just need someone crazy enough to jump and figure out how to fly on the way down. The CO stood up too, extended his hand. Not the practiced handshake of corporate politeness, but the firm grip of someone who's just had their world rearranged. When can you start? You laughed. I already did, 3 hours ago. Check your metrics tomorrow. You'll see the changes already happening. Their confusion was delicious. How could you have started implementing something before they'd even approved it? But that was the difference. They needed permission to begin. You just needed possibility. While they were sitting in this room debating, you'd already set things in motion. A few strategic calls to the right people, some subtle adjustments to existing systems, nothing that would trigger their compliance departments, but enough to prove the concept. By tomorrow, they'd have data. By next week, they'd have results. By next month, they'd be case studies in business schools they'd never heard of. You walked to the door, then turned back. 7 PhDs, each worth more on paper than you'd ever be. But paper doesn't solve problems. Paper doesn't innovate. Paper doesn't transform. People do. Specifically, people who've learned to think outside the very boxes that education builds around your mind. Oh, and next time, you said, maybe have better energy drinks in the vending machine. Monster's fine, but if you want real innovation, you need that weird Swedish stuff that tastes like battery acid and makes you see through time. They laughed. Real laughter this time. Not the careful kind, but the slightly unhinged laughter of people who just survived an intellectual near-death experience. As you walked out, you could hear them already starting to talk differently, using shorter sentences, making wilder connections. Thinking in spirals instead of straight lines. You'd infected them with something more powerful than any degree. You'd infected them with possibility. The parking lot felt different when you got back to your car. Same asphalt, same faded lines, same overflowing dumpster in the corner. But you saw it differently now. Not because anything had changed, but because you'd just proven something important. Not to them, their validation was nice, but ultimately irrelevant. You'd proven it to yourself. That all those years of being told you weren't smart enough, disciplined enough, educated enough, all of that was just noise. Your phone buzzed, text from the CEO. The board wants to meet you. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. You smiled and typed back, "I'll be there at 9:07. Sharp is for people who think time is linear. Then you cracked open another monster from the case in your trunk, put your car in drive, and headed toward whatever impossible thing was waiting to be made possible. Because that's what you do. You don't compete on their terms. You don't play by their rules. You don't measure yourself against their metrics. You exist in the spaces between their certainties, in the chaos they try to control, in the possibilities they're too educated to see. 7 PhDs, 7 minutes, 1 can of Monster, and a complete reimagining of what intelligence really means. They'll study what happened in that room. They'll try to reverse engineer it, to create frameworks and methodologies around it. And they'll probably write papers about it, present at conferences, add it to their curriculum, and they'll miss the point entirely. Because what happened wasn't about process or technique or even raw intelligence. It was about something much simpler and much more complex. It was about remembering that before we learned what was impossible, everything was possible. That before we were taught how to think, we just thought. That before we were given boxes to fit into, we didn't even know boxes existed. You hadn't outsmarted 7 PhDs. You just reminded them what thinking felt like before it got domesticated. And that, more than any algorithm or innovation, was the real disruption. Somewhere tonight, 7 brilliant people are lying awake, staring at their ceilings, wondering how someone with no credentials just revolutionized their entire worldview with nothing but caffeine and chaos. They're questioning every assumption, every methodology, every carefully constructed belief system that got them to where they are. And that questioning, that beautiful, terrifying uncertainty, that's where innovation really lives. You're probably already on to the next impossible thing. Another room full of experts who need to be reminded that expertise without imagination is just elaborate ignorance. Another problem that everyone says can't be solved by someone like you. Another can of Monster and another 7 minutes that will feel like 7 eternities to people who've forgotten what it's like to think at the speed of possibility.